I was exposed to activism in the pews, listening to daddy or to my great-grandfather or my grandfather and my uncles preach the word, and to actually see the response that they would get from the congregation. So the ability to move people into actions with words is what I was first exposed to. And then I would see my mother and my aunts and my grandmother in the choir stand, and they used words as well. This time it was song, it was hymns. And not only were they able to get people to act a certain way, they made them feel a certain way. So I knew that activism required, number one, a behavioral change. You got to change hearts and minds. And once you get them, how do you then propel them into action? The reason why I do this work doesn't come from a textbook, doesn't come from the universities that I've gone to. It came from a set of values. Values that were instilled in me from my parents. I do this work because it is who I am. I am Devita Davison, and welcome to my class. I grew up on the northwest side of Detroit on a street called Ohio Street, which is located between Puritan and Pilgrim. And what I can remember and what I love about growing up on Ohio, and particularly on the northwest side, and it informs my work today, is the homes that were occupied by the residents, my neighbors. They were homes where both mom and dad were in the home, and children played together on the street. We would come together after school, I can remember distinctly, and we would have on our block baseball games. As a child, I remember growing up playing Mr. Fox, what time is it? I can remember when my mother and my father and all the children on our block, we would go bike riding in our community. And mom and dad would say, don't go further than Wyoming, or don't go past 8 Mile, and off we went. So much so that growing up as a child in my neighborhood, I had 3 sets of clothes. I had school clothes, I had church clothes, and I had play clothes. Because that is what we were allowed to do as children growing up in my neighborhood and on my block. We played together. And what I did not realize is that it was unapologetically, and may I dare say, radically Black. All of my neighbors were of African American descent, and they were a cross kind of socioeconomic status. So we might have had a lawyer on our block, along with a police officer, along with a school teacher, along with a working and stay-at-home mom. But the one thing I can remember growing up on Ohio Street on the northwest side of Detroit, it's not about what I saw. It's not about the places that I would go riding my bike. It was the way that my neighbors made me feel. I felt as a child that my neighbors were looking out after me. Sometimes a little bit too much, because Mr. Burgess across the street was a nosy something or something. I couldn't make a move without him making sure that he told my mother and father about it. But with that, I knew that somebody was always watching. Somebody was always looking out. And somebody was always there if something happened. And that just gave me a feeling of safety. And so I can distinctly remember that about my neighborhood, my block, growing up as a child. And I'll say this, because that informs my work today. There's a friend of mine from Detroit. His name is James Vegan. And he was quoted in the New York Times saying this: "I want my childhood for my child in my city." And that's exactly the way that I feel today. I don't have any children, but I have a niece. And that kind of environment is what I want my niece to grow up with. The earliest seeds of when I became attracted to activism in my community, I think there are two. One has to be the fact that I come from a long line of people who are very active in the church, whether they were ministers, deacons, deaconesses, trustee board members, ushers. And so for me, a lot of the fire around being an activist comes from what I would call prophetic preaching. Men who spoke the truth, not only about the conditions of the day, but spoke the truth around what could be possible. And I'm not talking about the possibilities of when we see our Lord and Savior. I'm talking about the possibilities of what can happen while we're still here on earth. But they were very clear that in order to see that future, in order for us to make our wildest dreams come true, in order for us to be visionaries, we had to be executors. That means we had to execute. You know, I grew up in a family that believed that faith without works is dead. So you can't sit around and just say that you're going to pray and wait for God. No, you actually have to put your faith into action. And so I was exposed first to activism in the church, but then I was exposed to activism outside of the church. You know, during the Montgomery boycott movement that happened down in Montgomery, Alabama, in order to keep that movement alive, it was Black women who made chicken dinners, who fried fish, who sold cakes and pies. And a woman who was very active in selling chicken dinners and fried fish and cakes and pies, her name was Georgia Gilmore. And she started an organization that was called the Club from Nowhere. And she had to do that because these women wanted to be anonymous. They didn't want their names out there because they could face retribution. But the reason why these women wanted to keep the movement alive is because they knew that there was money to be found in the community through being entrepreneurial. And so Georgia Gilmore sold these items, and with these items, she was able to raise enough money to continue to feed the movement. And here's the catch. She did this in Montgomery, but word got out all over Alabama. And my great-grandmother, Big Mama, was in Selma, Alabama, and got the word. And she too started to fry chicken, make fish sandwiches, sell them at beauty salons and laundromats. And when was asked, what are you going to do with the money, Mama? She said, I'm going to send it down to the Montgomery Improvement Association, where this young man by the name of Dr. Martin Luther King was the president of the MIA, the Montgomery Improvement Association, because they got a strike going on. And so this form of activism and using food in a very powerful way, I was exposed to that at a young age. And that too helps to inform my work. The power of food and the power of the pulpit. So here's what we know. 3 things. The first thing that we know is that in many cases, especially as it relates to African Americans, your zip code is more important than your DNA. We know that. The second thing we know as it relates to how important your zip code is and where you live and why place matters is that during the pandemic, what we saw right here in the state of Michigan, that African Americans represented 13 to 14% of the population in the entire state, but represented over 40% of the deaths due to the COVID pandemic and the fact that many African Americans were sitting with what we call pre-existing conditions or morbidities that were in their body. That's what we know. We also know, if we take a look at the city of Chicago, which shares a lot of the demographics of Detroit. We know that you can get on the L train in Chicago and you can go from Lincoln Park to Elmwood. And there is a 15-year difference in the life expectancy from an affluent neighborhood to a neighborhood where Black and brown bodies are occupied. And so what we know is that place where you live, what kind of food you have access to, the environment that in which you live matters. And what I'm here to say, and the problem that I am trying to solve, is that everyone should live in a community that has fresh, culturally connected or culturally appropriate, accessible, affordable food in their communities. They should have good schools. There should be good infrastructure, and there should be safety. And specifically, the work that I am doing really revolves around food. How can we ensure that through the efforts of the community, we begin to build an infrastructure, a local food infrastructure that actually allows people in community where resources have been traditionally extracted from, communities that have been traditionally marginalized? How can we garner the power, galvanize the people so that we build a local infrastructure so people can have control over the food that they put on their plate from the seed all the way until when that produce actually hits their dinner table and hits the plate on their table? And so what I'm here to say is that there is power in food. And might we look at it intersectionally? Might we be able to create an infrastructure where people have control over the food that they put on their plate? And might we be able to do it in a way that also supports small business ownership? Is it possible that the people who live in those communities can also have control over the retail stores in those communities? That they actually own and operate the food in those communities? Might they also be locally sourcing those ingredients from Black and brown farmers who have and own land in their neighborhood, who are actually growing the produce that ends up in those retail stores and then ends up on our plate? And so what I'm thinking about is I'm thinking about the intersectionality of food as it relates to two things. Number one, solving for the problem of healthy food access, which directly relates to decreasing diet-related diseases. And might we also be able to solve for the wealth inequality and the income inequality that we see in our country as well, and begin to build wealth and power in Black and brown communities using food as a conduit to do it? For viewers watching this video, there are a couple of things that I want you to take away from what I'm saying. And I'll lead by saying this. And this is something that Grace Lee Boggs told community organizers and activists and folks who were looking down on the city of Detroit. Grace Lee Boggs told us, I feel sorry for the people who don't live in the city of Detroit. And here was a city in which 40% of the population was living at or below poverty level. Here's a city that's in my lifetime went from almost 2 million people to just under 700,000. Here's a city that was predominantly Black, where resources had been extracted from. And Grace Lee said, I feel sorry for people who do not live in the city of Detroit. And so what I want people to take from this video, using just that sentence from Grace Lee, is a couple of things. Number one, in order to do the work in community and economic development, you first have to have a vision. I say that to say is that even though when people would come to the city of Detroit and they may have seen vacant lots, they may have seen boarded up homes, they may have seen abandoned buildings, there were activists and organizers and farmers and entrepreneurs in the city of Detroit who didn't see that at all. You may have saw a vacant lot. Farmers saw an ability to actually own land and start to grow their own food. And so you have to have a vision You have to think sometimes the unthinkable. The second thing I want you to think about, and it's something that Brian Stevenson tells us, and that is you have to get proximate. You can't even begin to address or solve problems and be able to build community if you are not proximate to the people who are experiencing the most pain. You have got to be in community with those individuals. The third thing around community organizing, community or economic development, and how to build a just and equitable community is that power building takes time. I'm thinking about all the work that my ancestors, all the work that they did before they were even able to get the largest package of civil rights onto the president's desk during the civil rights movement. The March on Washington did not happen overnight. There were organizers in the fields doing sit-ins. They were on buses doing freedom tours. Some even shut down lunch counters. Some of them were building in churches. Community organizing that leads to systemic change does not happen overnight. You got to be in this work for the long run. Lastly, and most importantly, is that when you are doing this work, you always have to start with the why. Who are you? What are your unique skills and qualifications that make you so unique that nobody can do this work like you do? Start with your why. I was called to the work of community organizing, power building in community, community development work, because it started by myself looking really inward. There are a couple of things about community which is really important. Things that are the way that I identify. So I sit before you as an African American presenting woman. That's important. But I also sit before you as a first generation Detroiter. I was the first person in my family born in the North. My family is from the South. And I was the first person in my family born outside of the South. My mother and father were part of a migratory pattern that was called the Great Migration. Mommy and Daddy, along with millions of African Americans, stepped out for the first time without asking for permission. They stepped out. They left and fled for many of them. The domestic terrorists, the racial violence of the Jim Crow South. And they came to the North, my mother and father, Detroit, looking for a better way of life for their unborn children, my brother and I. And so I identify as a first generation Detroiter. I also identify as a climate refugee. After living in Detroit and graduating from Michigan State University, I went and I moved to New York. And I lived there for about 20 years, bought my first home in New York, in a maritime community that was called Freeport, Long Island. And in 2012, when Hurricane Sandy came barreling the shores along the East Coast, I lost my home. 9 feet of water ran through that house and destroyed it. And I came back to the city of Detroit. And after 3 days of sitting on my parents' couch, depressed, my mother said to me, as only a mother can, Devita, the Lord didn't send the waters to drown you. He sent the waters to move you. And you have to figure out, wow, why he brought you back to Detroit. And that was the beginning of really finding out my why to this work. Why me, Lord? Why did I lose everything? Why is it that I came back to the city of Detroit? These migratory patterns that tend to show up in my life has revealed to me a few things. Number one, place matters. The migration from the south to the north matters. The migration from a community that had just been devastated by a hurricane, I came back to my hometown. That matters. And I went into my own neighborhood, that beautiful block, Ohio, on the northwest side of Detroit, where children played. It was the area in which we went bike riding. It was the area that was lined with homes with moms and dads and grandmothers and grandfathers and children. And I went back to that block 25 years later. I had just left a community that had been devastated by a hurricane. And I went in my old community. And in comparison to how it looked like when I was growing up there in the 70s, it too looked like it had been hit by a hurricane. Now here's what my mother and father always told me: that whom much is given, much is required. And I had a plan. I thought that I was going to rebuild in New York and go back to New York. But the truth of the matter is that Detroit is a city that has given me so much that at that moment, at that time, I felt that this was my opportunity to give back to the city of Detroit. And my why started out of gratitude. My why started out at a place that has helped to shape me, a city that had made me unapologetic about who I am. That in its time of need, I thought, well, what can I do? How can I contribute? How can I give back to the city of Detroit? And the journey of my why began there. Why? Because I'm a daughter of Detroit. Why? Because it has helped to shape and create the woman that I am today. Why? Because I believe that the children of the city of Detroit deserve to grow up in the city, much like the childhood I had when I was growing up in the city of Detroit. And that really began my journey of my why. It's through my own personal lived experience and my vision to be a contributor, that when the story is written about the rebound, the resiliency, and the comeback story of Detroit, Michigan, I wanted my name to be in that book. And I wanted to do it in a way that contributed and that empowered Detroiters. So how is it that I was able to connect my why, my love of the city, the gratitude I have for a city that had given me so much, and the people in the city for loving me the way that they have loved me? Why did I want to give back to the city in a way that connected it with food and food advocacy? What were the dots? How did I make the connection? There are a couple of things. Number one, food has always been, for me growing up as a child, an act of fellowship. I can remember growing up, coming home from school. And again, I'm a child of the 70s, so I was what's called a latchkey kid. But I remember mom and dad worked, but I can remember coming home from school and having my keys around my neck and opening up the front door to the house. And there would be a note on the kitchen table, and mom would leave me instructions on what to do to get the dinner started while her and dad was at work. And she wanted to make sure that when she got home from work and got into the kitchen, there was a minimal work she had to do because I had already helped to start to get the dinner started. And after mom came home from work and Gadget came home from work, is myself, my brother, my mother and father sitting around the dinner table in the kitchen talking about our day. So food was a vehicle, number one, that not only taught me responsibility, helping my mother in the house, But I can always remember it being something that was at the table, and that table being someplace where I communicated with my family. Masteries, miseries, good times, bad times. Food was always present. So in essence, it was used as a way to bring people around the table, to have conversations. Sometimes difficult conversations, sometimes celebratory conversations, but food was always a vehicle to do that. Another reason why food was so important in how it played out in my life is that Mom and Dad may have left Alabama, the state, but they never left Alabama, the state of mind, meaning they brought with them on their migratory journey from Alabama to Detroit, like many African Americans did, they brought with them their skill set of how to grow food. And so all of my life growing up in the city of Detroit on Ohio Street, at my parents' house in the backyard, there was always a garden. Mommy grew tomatoes and onions and peppers. And so there was always fresh produce in the backyard. That was a means of survival. That was a means of being able to have power and control about what you were able to feed your family. I learned that very early on. And I also learned that a lot of people in Detroit did it. And so not only was food a way to bring our family around the table, my goodness, I can remember my mother outside in her garden, I can see it now, over the gate, talking to Mrs. Jones or talking to Mrs. Walker. And it also brought the community together as well as they sit outside talking about who had the best looking tomato, or talking about the collard greens. And girl, you make sure we don't pick those collard greens until the dew hits them right before the fall would come, bringing community together. And lastly, food was important to me because I saw it as a vehicle of entrepreneurship and wealth building. When Mom and Dad migrated from the South to the North, they brought with them not only the skills of knowing how to grow food, but it was that comfort. It was the connection of food that they brought from the South to the North. And so migratory food that was brought from the migration, that is the very definition of soul food. Soul food is migration food. And so when I look at the soul food restaurants in Detroit or in Chicago or Harlem or New Orleans or in Ohio, what I see is not only entrepreneurship and wealth building and small business ownership, but I see it as a way to preserve the culture. And so if I was going to be a part of any systemic change, if I was going to use my skills and my talents in order to bring about change in the city of Detroit and contribute to the vitality of the city of Detroit, number one, I wanted to use food. It's what I know, it's what I've been exposed to. And I wanted to do it in a way that was going to be sustainable and everlasting. And then lastly, why I think food is so important in my work is that Kimberly Crenshaw gifted us with the terminology intersectionality. And food is at the intersection of so many things. We look at food and environment. We can look at food and race, food and culture, food and community building, food and sustainable agriculture, food and health. And so food was used as a vehicle for me to talk about community development and economic development and small business development, but it was also a way for me to link and to be able to build on the long legacy of Black farmers and growers in the city of Detroit. And so how do I take what was already existing in the city of Detroit, this foundation of growing food, and how do I support the farmers or begin to elongate what we call the supply chain by helping to build small businesses and entrepreneurship in the city of Detroit, understanding that in the city already lied a legacy in which people were using food and the power of food. Identifying one's skills, one's talent, one's uniqueness in doing this work, yes, starts with looking inside yourself and determining what your why is. But once you determine your why, how do you then identify what talents, what skills, what abilities do I bear to bring to this work? What was important to me very early on is this willingness and this eagerness to learn in a way in which my mind was open to different methodologies, different ways of thinking, different ways of acting and responding and understanding the work that had been done before me and how I contribute. This willingness to take it all in. The willingness and excitement to read books and magazines and articles and to learn about the craft of community organizing and community development, to build up a body of knowledge. And so the first thing I was able to do very early on, before I decided to jump right in, is I had to understand the historical context. And that requires myself to do a lot of reading. And so one of the skills that I have and one of the talents that I have is I am an avid reader. I read everything. And so understanding the context, that in which I was doing the work in, is important. Building up your brain muscle, building up a bibliography of books that you could have at the ready, that you have read. So when it's time for you to actually make a statement in the public square, to lean into conversations that are happening in the public square, you don't have to run, you don't have to guess, you don't have to say something that you're unsure of. I come from a long history of ministers and deacons and deaconesses and people who were in the church. I myself was born and raised in the church. And one thing I know to be sure, and which Mommy and Daddy has taught me, and they taught me growing up as a child, is Devita, always be prepared for three things: a song, a sermon, and a scripture. Because here's the thing about growing up in Detroit in a Baptist church, is that I never knew when I was going to be put on program. And so I always had to be prepared. And I learned that very early on. So being prepared with a word was so important. And what it taught me too was the power of public speaking. It gave me a sense of confidence. As a little Black girl growing up in the city of Detroit and being able to stand before the congregation and actually have people listen to me, gave me a sense of confidence that people cared about what I had to say. And so it was a confidence builder as well. And it allowed me to tell stories and to articulate a message. What's so important in building up the skills and the talent is to understand the legacy that I come from. And that's this, is that during the migration from the South to the North, what happened is that a large body of African Americans wanted to come to the North so that they could start a life that was better than the life that they had, but to start a life so they could give their children the advantages that they did not have. It was important for me to use my kind of academic prowess or my academic curiosity. Not only was it important for me, but I will say that I was obligated to do so. And here's why that is important. It's important because my parents, like many African American parents that migrated from the South to the North, looking for a better way of life for themselves and for their children, what they did and what the city of Detroit is known for, and many folks may not understand this, but the city of Detroit and those parents and grandparents who migrated to Detroit from the South, because of the jobs that many of them have, whether they were school teachers in Detroit Public School, whether they were civic workers working for the city of Detroit, whether they were automobile workers working for Ford, GM, and Chrysler, they had good jobs. And what that meant is for the first time in many of the lives of African Americans, they were able to send their children to school. They were not only able to send them to private schools, like I went to private school, but they were also able to send them to colleges and universities, historical Black colleges. They were able to send them back to the South. They were able to send them to predominantly white institutions. I graduated from Michigan State University. So for the first time in ever a generation, African Americans were making enough money to actually send their children off to higher education. Detroit, Michigan made the Black middle class. And what the Black middle class did was they educated their children. And so for me, finding my skills, finding my talent, leaning into my academics, I was obligated to do that because I clearly understood the sacrifices that were made for me to go to school. And so those gifts I was able to find by leaning into what I learned at university. But not more importantly, what I learned in Michigan State University, but how I was going to apply what I learned on that campus and to bring it back to empower my city. In finding my skills and talents and connecting them, not only to my community, but connecting them to the country, connecting them to the world, it's a mindset that we have in the city of Detroit. And that is what the city of Detroit is known for. Some people know us as Motown. Some folks know us as the Motor City. But here's what I know, is that Detroit has always been a creator. And what we create, we move all around the world. We created cars, and we moved cars all across the world. We put the world on wheels. We created a sound, whether that be Motown, whether that be gospel music, whether that be house music, electronic music. We created it in Detroit and we transported it across the world. Ideas are birthed in the city of Detroit. So I was a part of a long legacy of individuals born and raised in the city of Detroit that actually got all of the knowledge, the skills, the know-how, the intellect, whether that be a product or an idea, and was able to spread that across the world. There are Detroiters that are Grammy award-winning artists, that are world recognized. There are Detroiters that are Pulitzer Prize-winning authors and playwrights. Books sold all across the world, Broadway shows. And so I come from a long legacy of Detroiters who have taken their ideas, and those ideas have germinated into other cities, other states, other countries. And so my connection to the city of Detroit is very much rooted in localism, but the ideas that I can spread are very much applicable to communities that may look like Detroit all across the world. Because here's what I know, is I know that anti-Blackness is global. And I know that the problems, the systemic issues facing Black and brown people in the city of Detroit are also faced by other Black and brown people all over the world because it's systemic. And dare I say, I see it as an honor, as a privilege, as an obligation to tell folks there's no need to feel sorry for the city of Detroit. Brilliance lives in our city. Excellence lives in our city. Innovation lives in our city and our communities. And I just happen to be a vessel. I just happen to have the privilege of sharing the power, the beauty, the models, the innovation of how Detroiters have cultivated and grown from the bottom up, not the top down, a local ecosystem around food that can be applicable in communities and cities all over the world. And I'm a proud ambassador of that, to share how citizens of the city of Detroit made a commitment that they were going to have power over the food that they not only grown, but they share with their neighbors, that they feed their babies, and the food that shows on the plate, they were going to have power over the entire system. And in the city of Detroit, we call that food sovereignty, having control of the food from production to the plate. And so many people around the world are inspired by Detroit. They come from all over the world to the city of Detroit to actually see how we were able to take a city that had been abandoned by capitalism, that had been abandoned by Ford, GM, and Chrysler, automobile factories, that had been abandoned by supermarkets, that had been abandoned due to white flight. A city that had been left for dead. Matter of fact, there was a presidential candidate who wrote an article that says, "Let Detroit go bankrupt." People had written Detroit off. But it is my privilege and my honor to speak across the world to let folks know Detroit is far from dead. There are visionaries and innovators that lie in the city of Detroit. And there are so many people that are responding to how Detroit is building a local food ecosystem. And I'm just happy to share the word. Another thing that was important to me as well on my journey of learning is to build an ecosystem of women around me who I could learn from. And the women around me, and to build a community around me of women specifically, came in all ages. For some, I was a mentor. For others, I was a mentee. But there were learning that was happening. There was vulnerability that took place in spaces, the sharing around conversations. When there were times when I didn't think that I could go on, the times that I would question myself. What am I doing? This isn't working right. Times when I've got rejected from grants that I thought that I had it in the bag and they just didn't come through. There were women that were around me that either understood what I was going through, could help to guide me, could help to give good advice. They were sounding boards. And so always create a community around you that will tell you the truth, that will help you grow, but more importantly, that will also help you be the best that you can be, your best self. Another thing that was important to me as I was on my journey around building community, is I stayed away from the thinking that I knew everything. What I'm saying is that you have to humble yourself. Here I am, in community, in many cases, college graduate, leaning on my learnings, leaning on my academics. But you don't know everything. You have to humble yourself and listen radically. Listen with an open heart. Listen with an open mind when people are talking and telling you exactly what it is that they want in their community, because they know. And your job is to listen, to understand, and then to figure out a way in partnership with them how to get that community what they need when they need it. Doing the work of community organizing and community building can be rewarding, and it also can be humbling. Especially if you've sat in community and with that community you've come up with a good idea, and you know it'll work in your community. The community has told you what they've needed, and you figured out a way with their help to actually get them the things that they need. But just because it works in one community doesn't mean it'll work in another. And so I remember coming back to the city of Detroit after I had lost my home in Hurricane Sandy, and this was before Food Lab Detroit had become its own 501c3 nonprofit organization. There was a meetup group. It was organized by Detroiters, and It was Detroiters who were food entrepreneurs that were cooking food out of their kitchens and baking out of their home kitchens, or frying turkeys in their garages, or barbecuing on the corner. But it was a meetup group. And the question became, Detroit is going through a revitalization or a rebound period. But in service of who? Where are dollars being allocated? Where is the energy? Many folks were like, well, it's not in my neighborhood. It's not in my community. But there was activity happening. There was entrepreneurship happening. There was energy that was in those communities. And the question became, well, how do you galvanize this energy? Especially around food and food entrepreneurship. And many entrepreneurs said, not only do we want to start our own food businesses, our own small businesses, but the problem, because community always knows what the problem is that we just don't have a commercial kitchen space that in which we can start our businesses out of. Meaning we can't become licensed food entrepreneurs or small business owners because there is not a law that allows us to legally cook food out of our kitchen and legally sell it. There isn't a system that allows us to do that. Currently, right now, because we aren't cooking our food out of a commercial kitchen space, legally we can't sell it because we have not been inspected. So we sat around in community and we talked about, well, what if we were able to leverage some assets in our communities? What if we were able to find kitchens in our community that were commercial? And what if we were able to connect you to these commercial kitchens? And what if the people who actually owned or operated these commercial kitchens would let our entrepreneurs come and use them? What if? We started to dream, we started to envision. How can we take pre-existing community assets and actually allow our community to use it so it's accessible to community members so they can specifically start businesses? And so we started searching. We went to churches, we went to daycare centers, and we asked, would you be willing? We went to Head Start programs. Would you be willing to open up your kitchen to entrepreneurs in the city of Detroit in your neighborhood so that they can start their own food business? And there were 3 that stepped up right away. A community-based organization, a Head Start program, a church who had kitchen space and wanted our entrepreneurs in the food lab community to use them. And we thought, oh my goodness, this is fantastic. This is great. My goodness, might we be able to take it to another community and do the exact same thing in that community? The community that I'm thinking about is a community that is a Latino community in the southwest side of the city of Detroit. And we went there with, our plan, our vision. I'm sure there's some churches in Southwest. I'm sure there's some community organizations in Southwest. I'm sure there's some Head Start programs in Southwest. Surely you all would want to know what we're doing. No. We entered the community wrong. We went over thinking that we had the solution that the entrepreneurs in their community wanted, not listening to the needs. But not only not listening to the needs, not listening to the barriers. The barriers in the community in Southwest Detroit were very different from the barriers on the northwest side of Detroit, on the east side of Detroit. But we went over with a package solution thinking that we had the answers. Yes, there were entrepreneurs in Southwest. Yes, there was a need for commercial kitchen space, but we hadn't built up trust. We hadn't built relationships in that community. We weren't invited into that community. And so the lesson learned is that, number one, we need to have someone that is in that community, that has built trust in that community, that can vouch for us, because that person is a bridge between us and the community members and the community partners in that neighborhood, and be called in that community, not just come into that community. And so what we learned is that, number one, all people of color are not monolithic, is that they have their own different sets of barriers and challenges. They want to be approached and worked with in different kinds of ways. But more importantly, when you're going into community, it is important that you have already built a body of trust and relationships in that community. Because if you have not, the community will shut down. And you won't get the reception, nor will you get the feedback, nor will a solution that you think might work in that, it will never get executed. So that was the lesson learned going into communities that were different from the community that I was from. And that is, form relationships. That the work that I want to do was not transactional work. It's transformational work. In order to do transformational work, in order to build that beloved community that Dr. King spoke about, it has to be built on love. It has to be built on trust. It has to be built by having relationships with the community. And that's something that we did not do. We went in thinking about the transaction instead of the transformation. And we did not spend enough time building community, building relationships, building partnerships. But that changed. And we did. We built relationships. We found partners. We built trust that happened over time. And eventually, and it took a while, but eventually some of the solutions that we had in the community on the Northwest side was adopted by the community in Southwest. But they took the lead. We didn't. We just gave them what was working in one community and said, here's what you can do in yours. And then we stepped back. And so always know that there are people in community that have the power, that have the resources, that may even have the desire to maybe even execute upon a plan, but you have to let that community lead, not you. And you have to be humble enough to then step back and let and allow that community to lead. I think another thing, and these are proverbs that when I'm doing this work that I live by. And one simply says, is an old African proverb, and I want more people to understand this when they are doing work in community, and that is, nothing about us without us is for us. Nothing about us without us is for us. That means if you are starting your community engagement in the middle of your project, if you want to come to the community after you've already designed your project, if you now want to get feedback to the community after you've already implemented your project and wondering why it's not working, you're doing it wrong. Community should be in the beginning at all times. And they should be also leading the project. They should be informing. They should be guiding. They should be leading, and they should be evaluating. How are you building into your plans? How are you building into your strategy, ways in which the community can hold you accountable to what you said that you were going to do? I think another thing that is so important in doing the work of community organizing, community building, community development is something that I heard from an Aboriginal elder who simply said, if you have come here to save us, don't come. But if you have come here with the understanding that your liberation is tied with mine, then we can work together. And I think that is so important in doing the work and working with community, is to understand that when we all are bound together and understanding that if one of us is not free, then none of us are free. And understand that community that you are not proximate to or that you do not live in, they should not be othered. Those individuals over there, that community in that neighborhood, oh, that doesn't apply to me. The way systems work is that it may not apply to you today, but it very well could be applicable and in your backyard tomorrow. And so understanding that we are all of the human race and that we are more connected than we think we are is so important in working with community. Movement building work, wanting to create systemic change in your community. That's long, hard work. This work does not happen over a year or 2 or 3. This work happens over decades. How do you balance the urgency of now against the slow grind of systemic change, which is required through movement building? And when asked that question, the thing that comes top of mind is never allow the perfect to be the enemy of the good. And what I mean by that is that you don't have to wait to get it right all the time for it to be perfect. Number one, I think what perfection does, it becomes so intimidating that people don't even move. People don't even mobilize. It's urgent, yes, but you want to get it right. You have to say the right things. You have to do the right things. You got to be perfect in all cases. No, it can be good. And you can build upon the good to get to the perfect. And what I mean by now, the urgency of now and related to systemic change and movement building is there are a lot of things that have to happen along the way around seeing change. But the beauty of all of those events is that what it does is it leads to building community and relationships. So the urgency of now, I need to do something now. We see that today as people take to the streets. They're building community. That's urgent. It's important that we lean in, that our voices are heard, that we are expressing ourselves. That is urgent. Be clear, be concise in your voice and your message. Speak up, stand up, shout. That's important. Well, will it lead to systemic change tomorrow? No. But that's not the goal. The goal is to start to build community. The urgency of now. I want to do something right now. We need something right now to happen. I think what we are seeing across this country is that systemic change happens on the local level. The urgency of now. Get involved on the local level. And I'm hoping that somebody is watching me right now. I hope she's a young girl. I do. I hope she's between 23 and 32 years old. I do. I hope that she's right now working in a nonprofit organization like I was when I was that age. I do. And I hope that she's thinking about running for office. Anything. City council, school board, congresswoman. Hope you're thinking about doing it on a local level. Is because when we want to see big systemic change happen in this country, is that we have to get involved. The urgency of now, the time right now for young people to get involved is like never before. And I hope that someone is listening to this who might be a little bit older, who might be seasoned, like myself. You might be in their 50s. Maybe you're the executive director of an organization. Maybe you have been in office for a while. The urgency of now is for you. How are you getting the young people engaged? How are you helping to build a legacy that you can pass off to someone younger than you? Who are you grooming? Who are you teaching? Who are you helping to build up who can come behind you? Movement building work is long work. Systemic change takes a long time. How are you preparing the next generation to carry the torch? The urgency of now. Young people, get engaged now. More seasoned elders and activists and organizers. How are you getting young people involved now, right now? And for those of us who just want to be active citizens, how are you lifting your voice? How are you putting your body on the front line? How are you engaging in citizenry in this country right now? And here's the thing. In doing this work, you have to set clear boundaries for yourself. You have to be able to protect yourself. You cannot do all things for all people all the time and not take care of yourself. So you have to set clear boundaries and be unapologetic about setting those boundaries. Someone once told me that no is a complete sentence. No. Try it. No. There's nothing wrong with that. You have to be able to protect yourself. You can't give people something that you don't have. So if you're depleted, how can you give anything to anybody else? What's so important is that you honor yourself and you honor the work that you are doing. Treat it as a craft so that you are building and that you are curating a body of work. That means that you're writing, that you're speaking, that you're lecturing, that you're building up a body of work that helps you to become more informed and also informing others. That you are building a body of work where you're building off of the works of others. That you're contributing in a meaningful way to a conversation, but you're always making yourself stronger. And you're doing that in a way in which you are contributing. Think about writing an op-ed. Think about writing an article. Think about writing a book. How are you positioning yourself as what we call a subject matter expert? Focus on one thing. That one thing could be intersectional, but it is specific. Some people don't know my name. Many people don't know my name. But you know what they know me as? The food lady. Because I focus on one thing, and that's food. And the way my work shows up in food is intersectional. I could be talking about food and jobs. I could be talking about food and agriculture. I could be talking about food and climate. I could be talking about food and culture. But I'm always centering my work around food. Be specific in whatever craft that you're going into. One of the things that I love about Food Lab Detroit as an organization is that from the very beginning, Food Lab was very clear about its values. And we put our values out there with the hopes of drawing other people in. Not preaching to other people, not trying to convert people, but going by the belief that there are people out in the entrepreneurial small business community that share these same values. There are a couple of reasons why we thought that. Number one, Food Lab was very connected to and paid close attention to and under the advisory of Ari and Paul, who were the founders and co-founders of Zingerman's. And so we learned a lot from the Zingerman's model around values and visioning. We were paying very close attention to something that was called the B Corp movement. And B Corps are a legal designation for corporations who are operating large corporations at the intersection of not only paying attention to the profit, which is one bottom line, but paid attention to the people that they were hiring, paid attention to the vendors that they were using, paid attention to the people that were hiring and the wages that they were paying the people and the benefits that they were offering them. And also paying attention to the planet, the 3 Ps. Paying attention to if they were locally sourcing the ingredients, if they had a waste mitigation plan, if they had a sustainable plan for their business. These are large corporations. Patagonia, Ben & Jerry's, Jenny Splendid, large corporations. And we thought, we might not have large corporations in the city of Detroit, but are there small organizations that share those same values around how you can actually do business without being exploitive? Is that even possible to actually make money in a business and then being able to use that money for the common good? And so Food Lab Detroit had a list of values that we called our guiding principles. Values around sustainability and leveraging this work in honor of Detroit farmers and growers. Values around using food as an inspiration of joy, an inspiration of community building, an inspiration of health. We had values around being humble to be great, not thinking that we knew everything, but we were going to be great only if we were a community of greatness, not individuals. And so how do you bring people together around a set of values? You have to be very clear about what those values are. Be very transparent around what those values are. And see who comes to you. But here's the catch, or at least it was for us, is that you can have a set of values. You can be very clear about them. You can bring people together who are like-minded. But what we wanted to do was to even take it a step further in terms of how do you take these values? How do you begin to build businesses around these values? And then how do you measure the impact of these businesses with these values and the impact that they've had on the community, right? And so not only were the set of values important that we laid out, but we came together as a community to talk about how do we build accountability into these values. If we say that we care about sustainability, how are we measuring that? If we say we care about people and we want to create new businesses, particularly in food that aren't exploitive but are actually paying people a living wage, and dare I say offering our employees benefits, how are we measuring that? How are we holding each other accountable to that? And so coming with a clear set of values, being transparent about what those values are, but holding people accountable to those values as well that lead to impact is really important as well. So having values, yes, that's important, but actually having a set of metrics to actually measure your values against is even better. Things that inspire me and the work that I do. I think number one is the 60 panels within the Jacob Lawrence series that's called the Migration series. I love the work of Jacob Lawrence, and I love that series that he depicts in his paintings that tell the story of the Great Migration of African Americans migrating from the rural South to the North. The second inspiration that I have is the film Daughters of the Dust by Julie Dash. She tells the story of a family that in South Carolina, the Geechees in Gullah Island, and their connection to the past, their connection to their ancestors, the present family, and how that ties to the future. And it was one of the first films that was produced and released by an African-American director and producer that really got kind of mainstream momentum. So Daughters of the Dust, and of course, Beyonce was inspired by Daughters of the Dust for her video on the Lemonade album. So just beautiful work there. One of the things I love, and I am a Detroiter, music inspires me. And if you really want to hear some good gospel music, the gospel music that I grew up on, it comes out of the city of Detroit. And I'm old school. So I grew up in the old gospel music that was represented by big church choirs. So I'm talking about Donald Vail and the Choraleers. I'm talking about gospel music from choirs like the choir that was led by Mattie Moss Clark, the Southwest Michigan Choir. I'm talking about choirs like the Mississippi Mass Choir or the Brooklyn Tabernacle Choir. All of that sound, those voices, the community coming together in song and praise. That inspires me. Another thing that inspires me is a book that I recently read and a play that I recently saw on Broadway. And dare I shout out Michael Jackson, who is also a Detroiter. His Pulitzer Prize winning book. His Broadway show just won a Tony, and that's A Strange Loop, that really depicts in a very beautiful but way that it made me breathe, and I'm still thinking about it, is the life of a Black queer man who is in the city of New York trying to make it as a playwright. Just that body of work inspires me. And the poetry that inspires me is the poetry, and he is a theatrical poet, is the poetry of August Wilson. His plays depict Black life in Pennsylvania. Some folks know Fences. Other people may know The Piano Lesson, Mama Rainey's Black Bottom, but he is the poet of Broadway, and his poetry inspires me every day. I turn to resources on a daily basis. So I get up 5 o'clock, 5:30 in the morning, and the first thing that I'm doing is I'm probably checking my news feed, and I am reading papers every single day. So I'm reading New York Times, I'm reading Washington Post, I'm reading Wall Street Journal, I'm reading the Financial Times. So I stay abreast of what's happening locally. And it's important for you to support local journalism wherever you may be, but I also read papers that cover the nation and also the world as a resource. I try to be as formed as possible before I start my day. One of the things that I really love is I also like reading policy papers as well. And so I turn to the Brookings Institute. They have some great reports. They do some future trend thinking. They're doing data analysis. They are very forward looking in their approach. And so I read papers that comes out through Brookings. I find myself gravitating toward TED Talks for inspiration, great speakers that I learn from, great storytellers that I'm inspired by. So TED Talks are a great resource for me. Another resource that I turn to all the time is the census data. And I specifically like the census data that is broken down on the community level. And it gives me a view of demographics, of where communities are, who lives in those communities, the socioeconomic status of that community, the population of that community, the change in that community. And so I'm really looking at the changes, the shifts in the community because I'm looking at gerrymandering that's taking place. I'm looking at gentrification where people are moving in and out of community. I'm looking at who's representing that community. So I turn to the census data quite often. An organization that I have a great deal of respect for and they have a wonderful resource page, and that organization is called Policy Link. They do amazing reports. They actually have done the report about even the city of Detroit and the impact that racism in the city of Detroit has had on jobs and the ability for African Americans and people of color to have upward mobility in the city of Detroit. So Policy Link is a wonderful website that I turn to all the time. In closing, my final encouraging words would be that everyone has a personal GPS. I call it women's intuition, your gut, or heart song that piques your interest, that helps you to become your better self. And your only job is to figure out what is that your intuition is telling you. What is your heart song? What is it that piques you? And for you to discern and for you to listen. Are you listening to your intuition or are you listening to your head? And if you listen to your intuition, if you listen to your heart song, it will lead you to be your best self. It will lead you to the highest of highest heights. That's the first thing. I think the highest honor on earth is for you to be who you are. That you are perfect as you are. Now, a lot of people may tell you that you are supposed to take care of others, that you're supposed to go to work, that you're supposed to take care of your community, take care of your family, solve all the problems. No, that's not what you are. You may be obligated to do those things, yes, but the highest honor of what you have to do is you have to be you. And you have to figure out who you are. And once you figure out who you are, then the next thing you're supposed to figure out is why you are here. Why are you on this earth? And when you figure that out, the next thing you have to do is get busy. Get busy doing the work. Your values will shape your work. Not your degrees, not your skill sets, not even your talents. That won't shape your work. It didn't shape mine. What shaped my work is my values. It's what I learned from grandma. It's what I learned from my grandfather, my mother, and my father. It's what I learned with the village of matriarchs around me who instilled in me a set of values and morals. That is what guided my work. And I hope that you have the values that have been instilled in you that help to guide yours. Good luck.